When most people die, they plan for a traditional funeral and burial. But for some, death is an opportunity to make a last memorable statement about their life. On this special episode of The Will, we'll take a look at those thinking outside the box, so to speak, by pushing the limits and making some very outrageous final wishes.
One of the problems with dying is that you're perpetually silenced, and I think some people want to speak after death, and they do so through their will.
The definition of a will is what you will to be done to you. This is someone's last say, their final wish, and for many people, it's their final revenge.
A lot of people think that it's like an 11th commandment from God, and whatever provisions they put in there, they think people are bound to have to carry them out, and it's just not that way.
I'm definitely shocked how far they'll go. When someone dies, to give a larger-than-life experience for those attending, yeah, a lot of things shock me.
3, 2, 1, lift.
Some choose to blast off into the unknown in an explosive send-off. Others have bizarre things done to their bodies for the sake of a cause. A few have off-the-wall ideas of what a coffin should be and have chosen to be laid to rest in everything from a shoe to a guitar. Renowned philosopher Jerry Bentham decided to be placed in a cupboard for viewing purposes. It's hard to believe what some have requested at their funerals. People have asked to watch one last football game on their favorite recliner, or even a final ride on a prized motorbike. Others have a strange way of honoring human remains, like Keith Richards, who admits to inhaling his father's ashes.
People have been requesting unique things for ages. The ancient pharaohs used to be buried with their treasures.
And I believe that Napoleon wanted his heart cut out and sent to his wife after he was dead.
I think people choose to do different things when they die is to just expand on what they were in life. The best part about my job is the first 3 letters in funeral are fun, so why not sometimes give people what they want to do and expand on what they were in life and then what they can be in death.
Others have less noble plans and use their wills to hatch bizarre revenge schemes from the grave. These wills are written to make trouble for people, whether it's to make dubious political statements or to get back at family members that irked them while alive. Take the bizarre story of Iowa attorney T.M. Zink. Zink hated women. In fact, he loathed them so much that his $100,000 estate was to be placed in trust for 75 years. In 2005, the accumulated principal would be used for a bizarre purpose: the building of a womanless library. Zink explained, "My intense hatred of women is not of recent origin or development, nor based upon any personal differences I ever had with them, but is the result of my experiences with women, observations of them, and study of all literatures and philosophical works. There would be no books by women, and no women would be allowed to enter the building."
In this will, the daughter got $5, the wife got $0. This will was bound to be challenged, and this woman is here to tell you that this will could not be probated because it was discriminatory.
Most all states have laws against that, where if you're gonna, disinherit a wife, you need to divorce her. You can't do it through a last will and testament. I know in the state of Florida, surviving spouse is entitled to at least 30%. In most states, it's some percentage or even 50-50.
The will of T.M. Zink is a classic example of why you really should never use a will to get revenge.
You could hate someone all you want, but you can't do it and hurt the public. And in this case, he was hurting, even though private, wife and daughter, public. Can't be carried out. Discriminatory. Thumbs down.
The guy was a lawyer, so you'd think he would know better than putting up some crazy will like this that caused his poor daughter to have to go to court to quash it, which she did, and she ended up with all the money.
More often than not, these revenge plans are directed at a spouse. Samuel Bratt was a wealthy man who could easily afford the finest cigars. Unfortunately for Samuel, he was married to a woman who never let him smoke. So Samuel stipulated in his will that his wife would only receive his sizable fortune of 330 pounds if she smoked 5 cigars every day for the rest of her life.
That's calling back at you, babe. This is my little to you.
Something like this would not go over well in court at all.
You can't require someone to essentially kill themselves by smoking 5 cigars a day.
I mean, this is an example of a person in a vengeful type will trying to put these conditions on getting an inheritance like that. You know, one of the things to having a will or a trust thrown out or provisions thrown out was the person competent when they made the request. The judge would just deem that you were not competent when you made such a request, so they're just going to forget about that whole provision. And who's going to enforce it anyway? Who's going to follow her around to see if she smoked 5 cigars a day anyway? It's insane.
On the other hand, some spouses will go to extreme lengths, no matter how troublesome the task, to make sure that their beloved's final wishes are carried out. Legendary comic book editor Mark Grunwald was so possessed by comic books that he had some unusual plans for a final issue of his favorite series. Marvel, the iconic comic book publishing company in New York City, was a hotbed of activity in the 80s and 90s when Mark Grunwald became an editor.
In the early 80s, I want to say 1981, 1982, Mark was promoted to being a full editor, in which role he oversaw what we think of today as the classic Marvel Heroes line of titles. So the Avengers, and Iron Man, and Captain America, and books of this sort.
Mark was the consummate fan-turned-pro. He really lived and breathed comic books. He loved everything about them, the artists, the storylines. Comics defined his existence. They really meant everything to him.
The atmosphere he created at Marvel was zany and spontaneous. There was no shortage of strange activities occurring at any given moment.
In addition to his more serious editorial duties, Mark was also sort of the self-appointed morale officer of the Marvel Comics floor at the time, because he was an inveterate prankster. He loved to pull a prank and a gag, and he would do so mercilessly to the best friends that he had.
No one was safe from his elaborate gags. Everyone was always on the lookout for what he was up to, knowing full well that they could fall prey next. One of his favorites was going around the Marvel offices to test the incredible superpowers of his comic book characters on his friends. Another strange occurrence would happen on late nights, when Mark and his colleagues would end up sleeping under a desk that he had built for this purpose.
Mark and one or two of his assistants or bullpen people would spend all night or even all weekends in the offices. Motivated by, I don't know what, that particular day, Mark constructed a huge platform to put under his desk and the desk of his assistant editor. It must have been 18 inches, 2 feet tall, so that all the furniture was up. You would step into his office and they'd all be up on these like stilt platforms. What Mark had done was he had built a trapdoor in this platform and built kind of like a little cave that had a sleeping bag and a little portable television and a tiny little refrigerator. And so getting around 11:30, if somebody was there, one of the guys working on this book, they would go into the restroom and wash up and go over to Mark's office and open up the trapdoor and climb into this platform box and stay there and sleep there all night until the following morning when the office is open, and they would crawl back out. There was nobody quite like Mark. anywhere to this day.
Then when Mark Grunwald suddenly died of a heart attack in 1996 at the age of 43, everyone first thought that this was just another prank.
It came as a complete shock to me in the morning when he woke up at 7 o'clock and was thrashing around. I thought he was teasing me. Luckily, his sister and family had come the day before for a 2-week vacation at our summer house, and we were all together, and I screamed, "Gail, get in here!" And she came running, and she looked at him and said, "I think he's dead." And I said, "What? He can't be dead."
We thought it was a joke. We thought this was Mark just pulling a fast one. We had seen him literally 72 hours before, and he was perfectly fine. I would not be surprised to this day if Mark came walking in that door right now and went, "Surprise, it was all a big put on. I've been alive and living a secret life under my desk all these years."
Mark left a daunting task to his wife.
I kind of knew when I opened up the will what was in store for me. I want to be cremated and my ashes put into a comic book. I said, okay.
Having known Mark, it was surprising but not surprising. He had clearly devoted so much of his life and energy and love and passion to comics and Marvel in specific that, on the one hand, while it's sort of a grotesque idea, on the other hand, it made perfect sense for him. Of course, this is what he would want done with his remains. He would want to be a comic book in his afterlife. We were determined to actually get this to happen.
This presented a series of difficult challenges.
There was a lot of concern. We didn't even know if it was necessarily legal. We didn't even necessarily know that it could be done.
I mean, it's pretty crazy to put your ashes in a comic book to actually conceive of that, but I think that was typical Mark Grunwald. I mean, just to be a comic book writer, if you've ever read that stuff, you know, you gotta wonder, these are some pretty creative people.
We decided to actually go ahead with his final request and mix his ashes into the trade paperback reprinting of his Squadron Supreme limited series.
It was up to his wife to execute his final instructions.
We had to get down to brass tacks, and I said, well, I've cremated him. I have these cremains, and we need to put them into some comic book.
When a body's cremated, it just doesn't turn into a fine powder. What's left after the cremation process is bone fragment. What happens then is if you want a very fine ash, you want to make sure that you pulverize that bone fragment far enough to where you can get to what you're looking for. This woman was looking for putting it in a printing press. We obviously would want to have that in a very fine ash, and we'd pulverize it as far as we could to not cause blockage with bone fragment getting stuck in the printing press.
I got one pressman who wasn't freaked out by it. We stirred the ashes into the ink. You had to make the consistency so that it didn't gum up the works. And I had to pick all the bone chips out really fast, because I don't know if you've ever seen cremains, but they have bone chips in them. And I'm like, oh, this must have been his leg. Oh, this must have been his arm. Oh, and I was like, ah! Because I'm thinking while he's watching me pull these bone chips out, laughing his you know, otherworldly butt off. He was a practical joker. This was the world's biggest practical joke on his wife.
Placing one's ashes in a commercial product is a real fine line, a very dangerous one to toe, because if you place it in one thing, who knows what's next?
The issue with having a comic book with human remains in it, essentially, is that it's a little spooky to have in your hands a comic book read for the most part by children, you know, with human remains in it.
You know when people like this, when they turn the pages, have you ever seen people lick their fingers? Imagine if you licked your finger, if you turned that comic page, you're licking someone. That's disgusting.
I don't see that as being a real big issue because you're dealing with cremated remains. They're sterile, mixed with the ink, but some people might find that a little bit morbid.
The issues with mixing ashes with a comic book are very simple. One, you turn off your readership because who wants to read from a comic book that has a dead person in it?
As it turned out, a lot of people did.
When the Squadron Supreme book came out, we had an extremely good reaction that somehow the story of Mark's last wish had caught fire. Consequently, this book that we figured we would do a single printing of, and really almost entirely because of Mark's passing, we ended up having to go back to press on for 2 or 3 more editions. And in fact, in those later editions, we had to strip in a line that said, second printing, no ashes included.
It was only fitting for Mark Gruenwald, the heart of Marvel Comics, to make an incredible comeback in death as his favorite comic book.
So this is the Squadron Supreme collection that Mark is in. 320 pages of comics with little bits of Mark in it. It's only the first printing that has his remains in it because we ran out of ashes. We don't have any more.
I made jokes about, like, when I was being interviewed, like, yeah, he really threw himself into his work.
Next, 2 men with 2 equally far-out ideas about their final resting place. You might say their funerals were a blast.
Oh yes, it's in the will. You know, it's all described.
I wish I would have been there.
While most burials return people deep into the earth, some prefer to leave this world after death. Hunter S. Thompson was an American writer, most famous for his novel Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and he is credited as the creator of gonzo journalism. He decided the only fitting burial for him would involve explosives.
His idea of a perfect funeral was to be shot out of a cannon mixed with fireworks, and for all of the ashes to come down on his guests that were on his ranch.
Oh yes, it's in the will. You know, it's all described. It's gonna be a little hard to do, particularly with me gone.
His friend and longtime pal, Johnny Depp, made sure that his passing would be an event to be remembered. Depp paid millions of dollars for the construction of a cannon in the shape of the Gonzo Fist, Thompson's famous personal emblem.
His ashes were actually packed into a fiberglass fist. It was perched on top of a 15-story dagger.
Property goes back over the cliff, so I can do whatever if I wanted to build a...
The mourners were walking around amongst the celebrities. Japanese drummers were playing, champagne flowing freely, and then, boom! Yeah! Yeah! Out he goes with a bang.
That's it. That's my funeral.
I wish I would have been there.
Some choose to go where no man has ever gone before. Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, had otherworldly plans for his remains.
My father was really a forward-thinking man. He was really ahead of his time in the way that he thought about humanity and people around him. He never really dealt with the petty issues of the modern day. He was always thinking of what humanity could be and what he could be. It's someone really to look up to when you're a son.
Gene was a character. There are a lot of different adjectives that you could apply to him depending upon what your relationship was with Gene. He was mercurial, he was extremely intelligent, very forward-thinking, which is obvious. And with Star Trek, Gene had a perfect storytelling vehicle to make social and political commentary about his time.
In 1991, Gene died of heart failure at the age of 70 at Santa Monica Hospital Center in California.
It was the day after Gene died. Majel Gene's wife, then widow, Ernie Over, Gene's longtime assistant, and I were at the house. Ernie and I were sitting talking about a variety of things, and I looked at Ernie and I said, you know, and before I could say anything else, Ernie looked at me and said, wouldn't it be great if we could just shoot his ashes into space? I thought that was a great idea because I had it too. So I stood up and I walked across the front of the house to the family room. And before I could say anything to Majel, she was kind of looking at me and looking out into space and said, you know, I wish we could just shoot his ashes into space. And I was slightly stunned because I knew she couldn't hear us from the office, which was 60 feet away, 70 feet away. And I said, let me see what I can do.
The question was, how would they get Roddenberry's ashes out there? When it comes to manned spaceflight, there's really only one game in town. And after chasing them for months, their perseverance paid off when NASA finally granted their request.
When we got the word from NASA, after a year of no, 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 Majel gave us a 35mm film canister filled with Gene's ashes. We put it in a box, and Ernie and I got in Gene's old Rolls Royce, and with the sound of the music of Star Trek's theme playing in the background, we drove it over to the post office and sent it to NASA.
We are counting down toward today's launch of the STS-52 mission, and all is proceeding on schedule here in Flight Room 3.
The ashes went up with the Columbia Space Shuttle on October 22, 1992, almost a year to the day after Gene's death, in astronaut Jim Weatherby's personal possessions.
It certainly helps to be a celebrity to get into the VIP section in a space shuttle and get launched into space.
Kind of an interesting request. It's a fitting departure for him.
Columbia Launch Director, here to Ground 1.
NASA did it as an honor and as a tribute to Gene's forward thinking, because an awful lot of NASA engineers wouldn't have been rocket scientists if it hadn't been for the inspiration that they'd gotten from Star Trek when they were kids.
4, 3, 2, 1. We have ignition and liftoff of Columbia on an ambitious 10-day international research flight.
The ashes rode up on the Columbia. They were part of the mission, and then they were brought back to Earth because you cannot leave anything in space. Nobody really found out about it until Majel, a couple of months before my book came out, because it was supposed to be announced in my book. She just casually mentioned it in an interview that she was having in a Florida television station, not thinking that it would be anything other than a little bit of local news. And it was on the radio by the time she got into her car in the parking lot, and it was all over the world in a few hours.
Roddenberry's friends and family were disappointed that his remains had returned to Earth the same way they went up. So when they heard about a second opportunity to send Gene's remains into orbit, they gladly accepted. The first flight of Charlie Chaffer's new company, Celestis, carried the remains of Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry and 1960s icon Timothy Leary into Earth's orbit, where they eventually ended burning up in the Earth's atmosphere.
Celestis purchases launches as a secondary payload. You know, it's going up in conjunction with something else that's going into space anyway. Generally between 1 to 7 grams is launched into outer space at a cost of about $12,500. You know, it helps to have a little money saved up if you want to rest in peace in space.
Celestis had plans to launch Gene's ashes into space for a third time, and when his wife Majel died in 2008, Celestis and Gene's family decided that she should join him. This time, it was going to be a one-way ticket.
After my mother passed away, I received a call from Charles Schaefer. Well, he told me that he had a mission planned for 2012, and he was going to send my father's ashes straight out into space. He told me at the time that he would love to include my mother's ashes with my father and launch them out together. And this time, what I thought was so special was this wasn't a launch into orbit, but this was a launch into the great beyond, which I felt was something so appropriate for my mother and father to be joined together for eternity into the unknown, truly where no man or woman had gone before.
Next, a love of animals inspires two very unusual last requests.
Pets can inherit money.
I've left my eyes to the Environmental Protection Agency because they blind rabbits to test chemicals, and there's no excuse for it.
Some people love their four-legged friends so much in life, they decide that their money is best left in the paws of their loyal pets. These wacky wills bring a whole new meaning to man's best friend. Hotel magnate Leona Helmsley decided her dog was the only candidate for her millions. So she cut her grandchildren out of her will and gave $12 million to her dog, Trouble.
If you want to spite your family, this is the way to do it. Give the money to the dog, right?
Pets can inherit money.
You can even have the puppies inherit the money if you want.
However, whoever is the person who's in charge, be it the lawyers or anybody else of your choice, in charge of administering the estate, they will definitely be getting paid.
Someone has to administer that, and if it's handled by an attorney, they're more than happy to charge $200 an hour to feed Trouble.
Helmsley's dog Trouble found itself in a whole lot of trouble after inheriting her millions, even receiving death threats. Trouble's guardian, Carl Leckick, had to spend $100,000 a year on security alone.
You can't, give millions to your dog or your pet, disinherit your relatives, and expect everything to be fine. Something's going to happen, and when there's money involved, people change when people die, and you're just headed to court.
Turns out the dog couldn't defend his millions in court, and Leona's children got their hands on most of Trouble's money.
Yeah, no, you can use your will to be an asshole. And that's why we have courts, because the court will come in, and where you have a will where you've essentially just trying to be mean to people, the courts can come in and change the will, take out the mean parts and make the rest of it make good sense, particularly when you're leaving $12 million to a dog.
We'll never know if the Queen of Mean, Leona, left her money to her dog out of spite or love. But there's no doubt about what motivates this animal lover. Ingrid Newkirk is the founder and president of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and a force to be reckoned with. Ingrid Newkirk has bequeathed her body to the organization in a shocking way to make an unforgettable statement.
Well, Ingrid definitely sets the creative tone for PETA. She works harder than anybody, she works longer than anybody. She's just got a genius brain, and it's constantly going. Our interest is in getting public discussion on these issues, and to get people talking and paying attention, you have to be creative, you have to be clever.
Shame on you, Bert!
No one is better at coming up with cutting-edge ideas than Ingrid.
When I first came to America, I wanted to be a stockbroker, but my neighbor moved away and left a lot of cats behind. And thinking there would be a wonderful shelter, I put them in my car, took them there, and found it was dirty, noisy, a very frightening place. I had naively thought that in America, certainly, animals would be well taken care of, they would always have homes, somebody loved them. And it was such an eye-opener to walk into this shelter and smell it and see it and realize that these animals were quite desperate, standing at the ends of their cages, hoping somebody would take them home, and there weren't enough people. I just couldn't take it. I couldn't walk out of there and go back to my cozy job. I really knew I had to do something. I'd always loved animals, and I just had to get involved.
A near-death experience made Ingrid realize that defending animal rights while alive was just not enough.
I was on a flight in an evening when there was a terrific storm, thunder and lightning below us, and for some reason the pilot decided to descend, and we were caught in wind shear. The entire plane was thrown around as if it were in a washing machine. If I had died, my activism would be over. I thought, wait a minute, if your body had managed to make it to the ground in one piece, you can still use that to be an activist.
This terrifying experience led her to create a radical will. Her final wishes have elicited heated criticism, even from her own colleagues.
When I first told people what I was going to do with my body, a lot of people were absolutely horrified. Then I explained the reasoning behind it, and a lot of them mellowed, and some of them actually embraced it. Yes, our Vice President Lisa Lange finds it distasteful, and she knows that they're going to be stuck with having to deal with it when I'm gone.
One of the great things about Ingrid is that she's always open for debate, and she will listen to arguments. And yes, we did debate this. And in the end, I lost, and the will went ahead as planned.
In my will, I've left my liver to activists to use in France because that's where they force-feed ducks and geese to make their livers expand so painfully that they sometimes burst in their bodies for foie gras. I've left my ears to the Canadian government, so perhaps for the first time they can hear the cries of the seals and the seal mothers when they have the annual massacre on the ice. I've left my eyes to the Environmental Protection Agency because they blind rabbits to test chemicals, and there's no excuse for it. They can use my eyes instead. I've ordered that my flesh be publicly barbecued with onions so that people will smell it cooking, come over thinking, ooh, that smells good, and then realize it's human flesh. It's all the same. It's just that I'm a volunteer and the animals aren't. I have a tattoo of a lizard on my arm, and I want that cut off and made into a lizard skin wallet, which will draw attention to the fact that all these wonderful reptiles may not be cute and cuddly, but they die very badly to make accessories. I tried to sell it already on eBay for advanced sales, but they took it off. It was up for about 24 hours, and I thought, no.
The question is, has Ingrid finally gone too far?
When I first found out about Ingrid's last will and testament, I was instantly worried. My worry was that people wouldn't get the overall message, which is a brilliant one, but they would be so distracted with the idea that this woman wants to grill her flesh, or she wants her flesh to be grilled after she's dead, that they would miss the overarching message.
Oh, this is a very controversial will. This will be debated for sure, if it ever even happens. In her will, she says that her pointing finger is to be delivered to Kenneth Feld, the owner of Barlow and Bailey Circus. Now, I can just imagine Mr. Feld receiving this finger in the mail and going to see his lawyers and talking about the intentional infliction of emotional distress.
You don't cut someone's finger off and send it for a message. No, you don't do that. So generally, you cannot send body parts in the mail. It's illegal, unless it's for transplant purposes. And what are you supposed to do if you receive body parts in the mail? Return to sender. That's what I do.
Yeah, they've got a lot of legal issues here, along with who's got control of the body, who's going to dismember this body, and then what, send eyeballs to Congress? Give me a break. They're still going to eat a cheeseburger.
Well, a mortician's job is to put a body back together, not take it apart. They're gonna have to bring in a specialist that could sever the bone and do the job correctly. It's gonna be a messy job. And then with the whole rotisserie of the body over a flame, like you would possibly a pig, people seeing a pig roast with their body, and that's where I'm glad I'm the embalmer and not the chef, because I don't wanna be involved in that part.
It's going to be a huge problem. There may be parts of her will that they can actually execute, but there are other parts of her will which are going to be just raise significant legal problems. Mutilating a human corpse comes to mind. Defiling a human corpse comes to mind. And even though it's with the consent of the deceased, I mean, where are you going to find an undertaker to do these things? There's regulations against this right across the United States of America.
A lawsuit could be brought against PETA if they actually execute Ingrid Newkirk's final wishes. Because if she asks somebody to do something that's illegal, it could not be carried out. Because if it's illegal, a court would not accept the will. So, too bad, Ingrid.
I'm very keen on having this happen, and I've made as many arrangements. I think it's all legal, all tied up. It would be rather silly to be arrested posthumously, but I have some very brave colleagues, and if they needed to push the envelope with my body, they certainly will.
I'm sure she's got a whole bunch of lawyers telling her she can do it, but for everyone she can find saying she can do it, I can probably find 5 that are going to tell you that this is not going to happen.
So far as our research indicates, everything she wants to do with the disposition of her remains is entirely lawful. We don't expect any lawsuits from simply carrying out her wishes. It's an extension of free speech. These people are the ones doing horrible things to animals, and they've got it coming. I do think this is a very unique, but also entirely appropriate use of the First Amendment under the laws of the United States. She's going to continue to speak. If they want to try to sue over it, let them give it a shot.
It's very satisfying to me to think that that I have the chance to have my activism live on after I have died. It frightens me to think how short life is. I'm 61 now. I don't know how many years I have left, hopefully a lot. But the idea that it doesn't end with death is satisfying.
Next, these two have come up with creative ways to live on after death.
The executor had to go to the British government to find out if it was even legal to sever a head from a body to use it for a theatrical production.
He said he'd rather spend eternity down there with all that life and excitement going on than in a field with a bunch of old dead people.
When certain people die, they wish to serve a greater purpose in another form. Andrzej Tchaikovsky was a world-famous Polish pianist and composer who loved Shakespeare so much he wrote an opera based on The Merchant of Venice. Tchaikovsky lived in England and loved going to see productions of Hamlet, but was always aggravated to see a plastic skull being used in the famous gravedigger scene. He thought it should be real.
Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio.
When Tchaikovsky died of cancer in 1982, his friends were shocked to find the famous musician had left his skull to the Royal Shakespeare Company. He wanted his cranium to be in Hamlet.
No one's ever done this before. In fact, it was so new, the executor had to go to the British government to find out if it was even legal to sever a head from a body to use it for a theatrical production.
They had to send the skull off to a museum specialist to handle this because what we're doing is breaking it down. We need to get to the bone, to the skull. And to do that, you're gonna have to remove other tissues. You're gonna have to remove the eyes. You're gonna have to remove the brain, anything where the tissues are moist. And then at the end, you're gonna have to actually boil that skull to get off any of the excess flesh. People in that type of venue to restore those properly would be able to handle that better than an actual embalmer.
For years, Tchaikovsky's skull sat on a shelf in the prop room of the Royal Shakespeare Company because the theater was too afraid of damaging it. Finally, in 2009, an adventurous director decided to honor Tchaikovsky's last wish. He was on stage at last. The British media went crazy over the story, and after several months of production, the Royal Shakespeare Company decided that Tchaikovsky's skull was getting more attention than the actors. They decided to use a fiberglass cast of it instead. Tchaikovsky's skull is in the props room once again. But it's only a matter of time before the musician's head is back in the spotlight, playing the part it was destined for. While Tchaikovsky's skull collects dust on a closet shelf, others are collecting barnacles on the bottom of the ocean. Don Brawley is the founder and creator of Eternal Reefs.
Back in college, I used to do a lot of scuba diving with my roommates. We'd go down to the Florida Keys and we saw the damage that was occurring to those natural reefs. We wanted to do something to help improve that situation. We started playing with the idea of building reefs ourselves. We designed something called reef balls, which mimic natural coral heads. They're designed to be stable and create a wonderful habitat for the small sea life.
Designing an original structure to help preserve the reefs presented a series of challenges for Don.
All the other reef designs out there were getting rid of old junk to attract fish. We wanted to do something that mimicked natural coral heads. And we started playing with a number of different ideas. We made a lot of mistakes down the road. We went back to the drawing board many, many times. But we kept working on it, and we came up with a reef ball design which sustains the natural sea life. And nobody had ever done that before.
The reef ball was a success, and Don was ready to market his new product. But a surprising request from Dawn's father-in-law, Carlton Palmer, known to his friends as Petey, put a strange twist in their plans.
My father was a musician. He was an arranger and composer. He was an accomplished pianist and French horn player, as well as many other instruments. He was very fun and very creative. When my father found out he was dying, he asked my husband, "Do you think you could put my ashes in one of those reef balls you make?"
He said he'd rather spend eternity down there with all that life and excitement going on than in a field with a bunch of old dead people.
It sounded very unusual. It's not something we had ever thought of before.
When Petey died, the request that he had casually mentioned was all but forgotten. However, he was not about to let this one go.
At the funeral director approached my husband with a box of his ashes. It was not in an urn, and he said, "I believe these are for you."
Oh, I guess I am supposed to get these. And I started to remember the conversation I had with Petey. And now I had to think of how to make this happen for him.
They went to work figuring out a way to incorporate his father-in-law's ashes into the reef ball without compromising its purpose. The result was a success that had unforeseen consequences.
I was just doing this for my father-in-law, Petey, and people were like, "Wow, that's neat. Can you do that for other people? How much does that cost?" And one thing led to another, and we started thinking about it, and we realized we could do this for other people.
Eternal Reefs uses a simple technique.
Basically, we take the cremated remains, we mix it with liquid concrete, and form the artificial reef. We invite the families to participate in the casting process, a viewing process where they see it on land ready to go. And then we take them out on a charter boat to witness the actual placement of the reef. And we see a lot of tears out there, but we see a whole lot of smiles because they're laying their loved ones to rest, and it brings kind of closure to the situation for them because they know they're doing what their loved one wanted.
It's kind of a refreshing way to have your remains disposed of in an artificial reef. I mean, the sailors back in the war days, they used to just dump their bodies overboard and let the crabs and the fish and the shark have at them to dispose of the remains. And this is a very environmentally friendly way to maybe give back forever by having yourself part of an artificial reef.
A concept like Eternal Reefs represents the future of the industry, I think, in terms of ecological and environmentally friendly disposition of human remains. Reefs in the ocean is just the beginning. It's the tip of the iceberg.
Petey has left an awe-inspiring legacy and has inspired a whole new industry for his son-in-law.
I thought I was in the memorial reef business, and I realized pretty quickly, working with these families, that I'm in the closure business. We have second and third generations of families coming back to us to have their reefs placed near their loved ones. And this is all thanks to Petey.
Nothing brings friends and family together like a funeral. But up next, we'll see a last request that required friends, family, and a whole team of engineers.
Car's coming with me.
While some people wish for a simple ceremony, others become obsessed with their funerals and make elaborate arrangements for the perfect burial, no matter how challenging or outrageous. Rhode Island resident Rose Martin had a unique vision of the afterlife. She decided she wanted to eternally cruise the hereafter in her favorite car. The 1960s gave rise to the Corvair love affair. People developed passionate feelings for this car.
If you're like most people who are interested in the Corvair, you want to know what it can do in action. And here it is, dramatic proof that the Corvair delivers the goods as no other compact car can.
My mother was a very eccentric person. She was very well known throughout the whole town. She was very boisterous at the town financial meetings, and everyone knew her for that. She was the very first police matron, which she was very proud of that. I don't think there was a policeman or a fireman in town that didn't have a set of her pillowcases, because she used to love to make pillowcases, and then she'd give them to all the firemen and all the policemen. Those were her boys. My mother's first love, I'd like to think, was me. However, a close runner-up would be her Corvair, and I don't know who was in the lead there.
Rose Martin was so obsessed with her car, she decided to take it with her.
I thought it was crazy, really crazy. As a matter of fact, one of the things in a hospital bed, I said to her, I tried to con her out of the car because we thought it was such a foolish idea. I said, Mom, why don't you give me the car? I'll refurbish it because it's an antique, and I'm going to keep it as an antique. And she looked up at me, and she went like that. No, the car's coming with me. And that was it.
Burying a body in a car next to other bodies creates all kinds of problems when it comes to the law. Requests of this nature create a logistical nightmare for relatives. They have to go through all kinds of strange activities to comply with the law, and the Rose Martin funeral was definitely a case in point.
Someone had to step up and make sure that the Tiverton Cemetery laws were not being trampled on.
Well, at first, they came to us and requested that she be buried in her car, and we objected to that.
When we went to the cemetery committee, they were not in favor of this. There were some real concerns as for contaminants in the ground and stuff like that.
So we had numerous meetings over this, and after all these meetings, and we were assured that everything would meet the requirements, so we decided that she could be buried at the cemetery.
Even with the Tiverton Cemetery Committee's permission, the remaining task was not made any easier.
So we had to get a vault. The vault had to accommodate a car. I went through the phone book actually looking for cement tanks. And I found a company that had a tank that would accommodate it, the car, but it was in two halves, and each half weighed like 7 tons. We had a real snag once we found out that the car was 8 inches too big to fit into the vault. I got in contact with my mother's mechanic, Judge Murray, and asked him what he could do because he has a body shop, and I needed him to cut almost a foot off the end of the car so that it would fit inside the vault. Working with the blowtorch, they cut off the back end of the car. Then they removed the 8 or 10 inches that they needed to, took the back end of the car and reattached it to the main body of the car, welded it, sanded it, and painted it. And that's when it went into the ground, still tacky because they worked on it all night long.
The result took everyone by surprise.
We did not think it was possible.
We had to do it. We had no choice.
After putting her son through the ringer and endless hours of hard work, Rose Martin finally got the burial she dreamed of.
She'd bought it brand spanky new in 1962. Price tag, $2,500. And for 36 years, Rose Martin and her Chevy Corvair were a familiar sight tooling around Tiverton.
It was quite a scene at the cemetery. It was somewhat hectic. I know I had a lot of concerns to make sure that the car was going to fit in because now it's too late. Everyone's there, and what do you do? And there was a big crowd around. It was something that's never been done before, at least not in Tiverton.
She always told me that she was going to be buried in their car.
There were so many people, and the cars on Main Road were actually slowing down and stopping to where it almost created a traffic jam for people watching this car being lowered into the vault.
Rose Martin's final wish flew in the face of reason.
I mean, let's face it, what Rose Martin left for her children to do was huge. It's a big job, and yet these relatives and family and friends did what she asked them to do. A lot of times in these cases, when it's an outrageous request that requires a lot of work, it actually can have the effect of bringing the family closer together, you know. Why did they do all these unusual things for Rose Martin? Because they loved her.
It was very comforting to see that everything in the end, after all the hard work, came to fruit. And she did get her wish, and she went in the ground the way she wanted to go with her Corvair. I'm sure she's in heaven in her Corvair driving around, raising hell.
The funeral industry has always been big business, and there is no shortage of unusual burials all over the world. From jazz to military-themed memorials, people want their last rite of passage to be a unique reflection of who they were.
As we move forward in time, people are just going to keep wanting more and more when it comes to their death.
The sky's the limit of whatever it is that you want to put into writing. They could seem nuts, they could seem kooky, they could seem unusual, but you want to know something? A will is what you will to happen. It could be whatever. The sky's the limit. Do what you want. Just make sure it's legal.
I think it's really unique when people have outrageous final wishes. And I think what it does is during the funeral process and the mourning process, it allows the families to have some laughter and some joy while death is there among them. And to do their will at the end can bring a family closer and allow them to say goodbye in a way that's peaceful and not always so sad.
What might be normal to you might be crazy to everybody else. So just know when you're writing your will up, giving $12 million to your dog, freezing yourself, sending yourself to outer space might actually be completely a normal request to you. But it might seem completely crazy to others. To some, you're breaking a barrier of what you could do for posthumous activity. But for others, it's a way to contest a will.